factors for the timber, products and furniture industry study for the preliminary course. In this section, you need to learn about resources, alternative resources and limitations of resources, recycling and reusing, the concepts associated there, pollution, government legislation. You also need to identify how these resources and processes are used by a specific business and the impact they have on the environment. You need to identify pollution problems and recycling and the materials associated with a specific business, and also you need to understand and appreciate how government legislation is trying to make an impact here. So to get started on resources, what do we mean by resources? We mean those raw materials. We talk about the fact that in the timber industry, obviously, we are cutting down trees for the production of timber products. These trees are raw materials. Other raw materials include things like water, electricity, coal, gas, metals, etc. Most of the resources on Earth are limited in supply. So we have a responsibility to sustain those resources, to make sure they're available for future generations. When we're talking about the examples like coal, metals, gases, etc., we're talking about these being non-renewable resources. Once we run out of them, once we've dug them all out of the ground and the supply has been deleted, there is no replacement. There might be alternatives, but there is no more of that product. And so we have a really big issue with using too many non-renewable resources. And there's a whole heap of stuff around the globe about trying to protect the planet and those non-renewable resources. Some resources are considered to be renewable since they can be grown or reproduced without depleting the supply. Now, you can't always do it without depleting the supply. It's not always what's happening, but the goal is to try to only use what we can sustainably manage in terms of supplies. And this is where we're talking about timbers, waters, and electricities. When these renewable resources run out, we've got a problem. But the idea is if we're managing the processes properly, we should be able to make sure that the resources are available for future generations. And we'll go into quite a bit of detail with how timber can do that in a couple of slides' time. When the non-renewable resources are in use, the industry needs to try and think about ways that alternative resources could be used to try and minimize the amount of non-renewable resources there. So instead of always using metals, are there opportunities for plastics or other engineered products? Instead of always using coal to fire the furnaces, is there another material that can be used that is renewable or a little bit better for the environment? So those alternative resources, there's a whole heap of information here, but what we need to think is you can't always just use alternative resources. It's not always going to work to have an alternative resource being used, but when you can, you should try to do it. Plastics or polymers, metals and glasses can sometimes be used in place of timber products. But we actually worked out in a Australian government review in 2003 that they looked at the environmental impact of wood compared with alternative products used in the production of furniture. So a really specific study for us. And they actually said that if other products like metals and glasses are used instead of timber, it can actually be worse for the environment. And the problem is the amount of processing power that goes into those products. So timber actually is quite a sustainable resource, and it's really good to use timber in the environment because you're able to sink carbon. So you can store carbon in your tree. Carbon is naturally stored in the tree. And when you create timber products, you're locking that carbon up so that you can grow more trees to then help pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. We also talk about recycling and reusing, and there's a few examples here, not so specific to the timber industry, but to help you understand. But recycling is where you are reprocessing materials into a new product. So if you've got a car tire and that gets shredded down and used as a paving block or a rubber mat, then that's been recycled. It's got a new purpose. If you're reusing a product for the same thing over and over and over, you're reusing, you're not recycling. So if I think plastic bags in the supermarket, when I buy that Coles bag, I take it home and then take it back to Coles the next time, I haven't recycled the bag, I've reused it. Now, recycling and reusing has a whole heap of benefits because it can help reduce financial strains and is also good for the public image. There's lots of people that want to support companies that are environmentally friendly. And even at a local government level, councils are encouraging in-house recycling by providing recycling bins to homes and providing very very cheap options for them to get additional recycling bins to really encourage that recycling from happening. Businesses usually develop programs around reducing, reusing and recycling. So if you can't recycle it or you can't reuse it, then what they try to do is reduce the amount of it that they use. So if you're doing either the reduce, either the reuse or either the recycle, then you're benefiting the environment in some way. If you're doing none of those three, then obviously you're having impacts. If I go into a real specific example, say recycling bins are provided for New South Wales homes, okay, for papers, glasses, metals, and even more recently we've now got purple bins on the market for the return and earn bottles. So you can actually get an additional bin from your local council, the purple lid bin, to put your return and earn containers in to try and help even further make sure that recycling happens correctly. Then in addition to those local government and New South Wales level schemes, there are also national schemes happening. The Australian government has different policies and agreements in place for different industries, and tyres, car tyres is a massive recycling issue. It's a massive problem because when they catch on fire, there's all sorts of issues associated there. So the government has put together a specific scheme on how to recycle tyre products. They've done the same for television and computers, okay? Now manufacturers, in addition to their legal responsibilities to think of the reduce, reuse, recycle concepts around their products, they also have an ethical responsibility to think about the life cycle of their product. And how does their product impact on the environment in the end? Or how does their business that they're setting up impact on the environment? So there are a couple things to talk about here. Firstly, when you start a new business, if you're clearing land to build your factory, then you've had an impact on the environment. If you're creating a huge amount of noise in a quiet neighborhood, then you're impacting your environment because animals might be less likely to live there because they don't like the noise. So there's a whole heap of different things in terms of environmental impact of moving a business. But then in terms of the products as well, are your products designed for disassembly or designed for remanufacture so that you can encourage your users to do the right thing after their life cycle? Your ethical responsibility isn't just to selling a good product to a client, but it's about what happens to that product after its life cycle is over and what can the client do with it to help either remanufacture it or disassemble it for easier reclaiming of resources. Waste management is a reality for all industries, so we're talking about the bins here, okay, and how they get rid of their rubbish, and there's a whole heap of different things that get done. But it's important to note that how do people do this in the timber industry? How do we manage our waste? Well, separate bins. There are many timber furniture factories or timber product factories that will separate their waste so that things like offcuts of timber can actually be used for a second life. I know, for example, Cooper's Furniture at Caringbah, the great example we use, they put their offcuts, too small to use in their factory, they put them outside in a separate bin, and any of the local community people can come past and grab whichever pieces they want from out there. Stops it from going to waste, means that people in the community might be using it for firewood, or they might be using it for small hobby projects as well. Okay? But it's better to be reused and given away for free than it is for it just to be thrown in the bin and join the landfill. So that's a really clear example of what some of the timber products and furniture industry companies are actually doing with their waste. Again, we're talking about how can we reuse or reprocess them, and so if we're talking about the Hind timber mill here, when they cut the logs up, there's an amount of timber that can't be used for structural lengths of timber, and so what do they do with those? Rather than just throw them into landfill, they put them through the wood chipper, and from the wood chipper, those chips of wood are then used to power the kiln, so to heat the fire, to fuel the fire, to dry the timber out. So rather than using electricity or using coal to burn, they actually use the offcuts that can't be used for any other part of their projects and their products to help fuel the fires there. So you can see how reuse and reprocessing is working in those senses as well. Additionally, many companies will send their sawdust away. They get used in horse stables and things like that as well. They might get used by petrol stations for cleaning up oil spills and things like that. So there's a whole heap of different stuff you can do with your waste. You just need to look into what you can do with it, and your ethical and legal responsibility is to do something other than just put it into landfill. Air pollution is another thing to think about. There's a whole heap of dust and fine particles, fumes that comes from our stuff, and we particularly need to remember that our responsibility is to keep the air around our industries clean And so our dust extraction systems usually have filters in them to collect the dust. We're not pumping them out into the air, we're actually collecting the dust particles, cleaning the air, so the air that's coming out of any exhaust system should be clean air that is safe to breathe. And there's usually legal council requirements around those sorts of things. And the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, sets a few rules around the standards for how to control your air emissions. Around about 2016, I believe it was Borrell's factory over at Wethel Park received quite a significant fine from the EPA because their emissions were much higher than the allowable limit. The EPA came out, did a test, found that there was a problem, issued a fine, and issued a whole heap of recommendations on what they needed to do to try and control their emissions a little bit more. So there are government organisations, the EPA for example, that monitor and patrol those sorts of things. We don't just talk about physical pollution though in terms of like rust and air particles and fumes and those sorts of things, but we also talk about noise pollution. There are rules around when you can make noise, and it depends on whether you're in a residential area or industrial area or whatever. But if we use the example of Liverpool's council, if you wanted to use a circular saw which has a fairly loud decibel reading, just in a residential area, you shouldn't be using it before 7 in the morning or after 8 p.m. So there's actual rules around that, and if there was a breach of that, that could be reported to the council and to the EPA. And how do they monitor this in industry levels? Well, you can't just build a metal factory and have all your machines going in that's going to amplify the sounds. The EPA enforces the big factories running the industry have to be insulated or have mufflers installed to control the noise output coming from their factories. The council zoning is the big thing here. The government legislation and council zoning is the big thing here that has an impact on the amount of noise that you're allowed to make and the time that you're allowed to make those noise. So in commercial or industrial areas, there'll be different time zones that you can use. So if we think residential area was 7 a.m. was the earliest you can make sound, in industrial areas it's usually a little bit earlier, possibly even as early as 5 a.m. Now, there are some laws here that have an impact here, and one that you might want to note down is the EPA Act 1979. It basically says that companies need to do an environmental impact statement, an EIS, to consider what impact their industry is going to have on the habitats, on the species, the populations, the communities, the flora, the fauna, etc. in the area that they are planning to start their industry in. And you then need to think what sort of control strategies are you putting in place as an industry to mitigate the changes that you're having. And if your business isn't going to deal with it properly, you will not be permitted to build your factory and start your industry there. So that's all part of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. There's also a whole heap of government departments whose jobs are to look after all these sorts of things. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail, but you definitely want to know the Environmental Protection Agency as a key part of the organisations that sort of manage these processes. Your local councils, your state regional development committees, etc. There's a whole heap of stuff there. You can peruse through that in your own time. We spoke about the environmental impact studies, the EISs, and this is where you go through and talk about how is your business going to make an impact. Now, the reason I keep coming back to this EIS towards the end of that presentation is because of this question here in the HC. It's been a question that's actually come up a few times since. But what would happen if your company needed to move or was expanding its operations? So what if Coopers at Caringbah wanted to build a factory out at Leppington? What factors, other than the people that work there, so other than personnel issues, could affect the viability of the company at the new location? And at this point, you want to be talking about, well, they'd need to do an environmental impact statement. They would need to determine the impacts to the local flora, the fauna, if there's any endangered species in the area, what sort of noise pollution, what sort of zonings are they in. They're all the sorts of things that you would talk about. And then you could also be talking about, are they actually in an area where there are people that can afford to buy their products as well? So you can think of all of those extra bits and jobs. That's the end of the environmental and section there. I'm going to move on to sociological, which sort of links together now, and I look forward to seeing you in that next video.